I used to live less than a mile away from a landfill that happened to be right next to public housing, and my sister actually was diagnosed with asthma, and didn't really think anything of it as a young child, but growing up and really seeing the effects of communities of color and disinvestment, and something very shocking that the maps show. It's, I mean, those are the same areas that we saw like the 50 school closings. So to me, we continue to see uninsured individuals in the same zip codes, and I'm saddened by the fact that a zip code determines your life expectancy more than your genes and what diseases your parents might or might not have. So I am very excited to be here and to have this dialogue, to start the conversation about racism and structural ways we can do it, because at this time it's no longer good enough to do a Facebook post or Twitter. We have to uh, get our hands in there. We have to roll up our sleeves and change policy. So thank you again for making the film and bringing this to light.
We're going to dive in with you guys in a minute, but Judith, I did want to kind of throw the first question to you. This is a question that you asked to be thrown to you, by the way. But in terms of this film, ultimately, what were your hopes that this film might accomplish? The conversations that it might start, the action that it might.
I mean, it's happening right now, right? This is what we hoped would happen with this movie. We hoped that we could bring it home to Chicago. We hoped that it would be a room filled with people who came from many different neighborhoods, and they'd all be sitting in the same room at the same time, looking at this story, and doing some real hard thinking about what do we have to wait for the next extreme weather event to reveal the disaster that's here every single day, or do we take that 30-year life expectancy difference and all the deaths that represents and say, okay, like that's enough. My hope was that, perhaps we could take these very basic questions about what is a disaster, what is a public health crisis, how do we respond, and maybe, wonder, like, is it possible to use this crazy frame of disaster response, and spending $250,000 over a long weekend to practice for a tornado, which I understand could still happen. But while I was looking at it today, I was thinking, wow, what if they just ran in and said, we're going to do emergency dental care for everybody who hasn't been able to go to the dentist, and we're going to do it in 3 days. We're going to use $250,000 to address, some very acute health issue, like that everybody has, that we know that we could actually like work on real quick. Like, what if they just did that? What would happen? Like, what would change? So I think that we have a lot of opportunities to reimagine how to invest in the communities that have been most divested from, and the way to start is to work with those communities and the brilliant people who are living in them, who last night we had a bunch of them, including, your family friend, Danielle Perry from Growing Home. They're doing a renaissance of great organizing work on the south and west sides of the city that could actually address in a very structural way the disaster underlying the disaster. We just have to invest in it.
Just for the record, I'm 60653 in Bronzeville currently, but I grew up in Auburn Gresham, just south of Inglewood. So I did my back to school shopping every year, 63rd and Halsted, and was so glad to see Kennedy King relocate there. But it's still, in a way, and also if any of you know 63rd and Halsted, there's a Chipotle there now, and a Whole Foods, and a Starbucks. And 20 years ago, I could have never imagined that that corner would look the way it does. But even with all of that investment, it's still not quite as robust as it was many years ago. There is a central kind of conflict that's happening in the film, and I would say the first half of the film, as we're kind of seeing the body count mount in 1995, and we see daily essentially kind of in some ways or portrayed as the villain, or the city itself kind of portrayed as a villain, that it maybe didn't do enough and didn't act fast enough. From your perspective as people who work for city and county government, addressing issues with the climate, with public health, as a commissioner kind of serving a broad range of people in your district, what is a takeaway that you take from this film about what your role is in addressing some of the underlying issues that are spoken of in this film?
I can start, sure. So yes, I mean, as the representative from the Chicago Department of Public Health, first I'll just say that, this heat wave absolutely, I think, did change in very serious ways the way, as a city, we do think about that first level of disaster preparedness, not the underlying, but sort of what happens in that space. And, I look back on what's been going on the last few days here with the heat wave now, and in a very practical way, all that work that's in place. That's not really what the film is about, but it is. I do think that these messages and these pieces, like we take heat, we take the inequities that are in this city that mean that whether it's a disaster, whether it's a chronic disease, whether it's, those same maps that you're seeing there, our epidemiologist, everybody knows, makes these same maps today. Do people know Healthy Chicago 2.0? I'm just curious. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to Google it. Healthy Chicago 2.0 is the current city plan, and it's the public health sort of community plan, but it's subtitled Partnering Toward Health Equity. And it's easy to use these words. It's hard to figure out what exactly this looks like. And so I think as the health department, we have already, made commitments that we are not successful unless the people who are furthest from the health goals that we want to see are actually meeting them. So we don't measure success, for example, based on whether rates for health insurance go up across the whole city. We measure success on whether, in this case, young Hispanic men, which are the group least likely to be insured, are moving toward that goal. And so us thinking about how you measure success when it comes to these sorts of long-standing inequities, and then what you do about them, right? So that instead of thinking about, you've got mortality, you back that up, disease and injury, sure, you back that up, risk behavior, but starting to back that up even more and thinking about the living conditions, the social inequities, and then ultimately, the race, the class, the gender, the immigration status that drive all of this. What does it mean? Then, the new mayor is talking a lot about investment in these communities, but what that, how you make that happen. We already put health resources very disproportionately and appropriately into the neighborhoods where we see the highest effect. But on the larger issue with how this links to emergency preparedness, I would just say that, those emergency preparedness dollars are federal dollars in a lot of ways, at this point, that are defined in very particular ways. So we use them for not just natural disasters, we use them for infectious disease outbreaks, things like that. But we, as a department, are committed to working on these issues and thinking about new ways to move funding toward them. So that was a lot, but it just highlights how these pieces in the film are what we're thinking about and trying to work on every day at the health department.
I would say that the thing that bothers me a lot, and I hear a lot, is things being public health problems, but they're never funded. So it's one thing to blame it, put it in a department and say that's where it needs to go, but where's the money to do anything about it? So it's a nice, convenient, politically expedient thing to say, but it doesn't mean anything. So I like the idea, at least that people are thinking about it, but unless we resource it, it means nothing. So we look at a number of issues I see, and on the question of public health emergency preparedness, some people in this room, I see two of my staff, at least two of my staff here, but I've already been a renegade about that because I think it's stupid that we are using what limited emergency preparedness dollars we have for things that don't really matter that much, that we're not going to be able to do a whole lot about anyway. But we don't leverage it. For example, we have a major sexually transmitted infection problem right here in Cook County, both suburban Cook County and the city of Chicago. And I talk like that because I have to. Because I have to do this jurisdictional issues, and I have to be mindful of those. But what I would say is that I don't see why we don't take the federal dollars that they pay for people who work in our departments and leverage those dollars to deal with real world, I mean, beyond infectious disease, but for me, it's like sexually transmitted diseases. Our transmitted diseases numbers are abhorrent. They've gotten not better, they're getting worse. And no, we're not being appropriately resourced. So I'm saying, I don't believe that we should be using our emergency preparedness dollars for what the feds see it, because they're not looking at the local level. They don't see what our problems are. And right now, when I was the commissioner of health, and I'm going to say something that may sound a bit trite to you here, but when we were looking at the number of people that we had to turn away from our clinics, because you can only see so many people in the time that you have to see them, and you can only do so much with the resources that you have. But when you're turning people away with discharging penises and discharging vaginas, that's horrible to me. We shouldn't be doing that. And then if we begin to look at, well, where does this go? Do these sexually transmitted diseases have anything to do with why black women have twice, 2.5 times the death rate at birth than other women, or that our black babies die at at least 2 to 3 times the rate? And those numbers are not new. These numbers have been static for years. And we want to look at what's the relationship, if there is. I don't know, but I'm not a maternal fetal child person. But is there a relationship between these infections? There's some evidence that suggests that chlamydia induces premature labor. I don't know for sure. But we're going to get that. We should be working on those kinds of problems. Steve was a great guy. Brought back so many fond memories of a guy who really put his life and his work into trying to make a difference. So, yes, there's some things that we can do. Some of us just do it anyway. But at this point in my life, I don't care because I'm old.
But you could do it better with $250,000 over.
I need $250 million. Don't give me chump change. We have the money. Money is not the problem. The problem is the life and the livelihood of, I hate to say people of color because it's basically black, but people of color don't matter in this country. That's the elephant in the room. And we don't value even the opinions of the people that we're trying to help. And there are a lot of good people, many of them sitting on this stage and probably sitting in that audience. They do want to try and do something, but you're sort of stuck with where do you get in? Where do you fit? How do you make it happen? And it seems like we're giving such a real avalanche of stuff that is working against us. I'm not going to monopolize time, but I just, as you can tell, very passionate about this. And so I would tell my colleague at the Chicago Department of Public Health, use me to do the crap that you don't want to get in trouble for. Because I don't give a damn. I really don't. I am approaching the denouement of my career, and so this is going to take everybody making bold decisions. You will have to move out of your comfort zones in whatever way you see to begin to think about this. And so I don't need another 30 years of talking about racism and equity and all that sort of stuff. Given, got it, understand it. The next question is, how do we move forward? And what does that look like?
Well, so thank you. That's great. I'm so glad that he's at the county level and really doing great work. We've done great partnerships before, so I'm glad to have Dr. Mason. I think my job specifically as an elected official, I ran on a lot of these issues. I think over and over and over, we see things. There is some type of reactive action at the time, and then nothing happens. And we cannot continue to ignore the fact that we've lost a huge black population in the city of Chicago, Cook County, and in Illinois, and that has been strategic. And my responsibility as an elected official is to uplift these conversations and to continue to have them, because I mean the film highlighted a lot of the problems that we see day to day, but I dare to say that now is even worse than it probably was, because we're seeing the living cost, still there's a huge disparity and continues to be a huge disparity. We continue to see the, global warming. We continue to see, and there was an article a few weeks ago about the increase in homeless population in the city of Chicago. We continue to see this, and yet we don't see the action, the long-term productive action. So my job is, and the way that I see my role is to continue to uplift this. And, Dr. Mason just reminded me, we're actually going to do a resolution at the county level to declare racism as a public health issue. But it's not enough to just do a resolution. We have to, yes, put money down. I was actually shocked the other day. I had a meeting with our Homeland Security at Cook County, an emergency management department, and they actually stated that we get about over $20 million for vehicles and et cetera. I was completely shocked that we're still relying, yes, on the federal government to try to focus on the issues that we have at hand here locally, but not addressing the real structural problems that we're seeing here, the disinvestment, the fact that we're not getting resources into the communities, that we're not, that we're closing schools, that we're not focusing on how to be able to support. I mean, the fact that we continue to use the words about, pull yourself from your bootstraps. How can you do that if your boots have been taken away? Right off the bat, you're not going to be able to. Every type of investment that has been drained out of communities of color, yes, specifically Black, let's face it, and I'm glad that you highlighted that. And the fact that we're not seeing the true sense of humanity there is just shocking. And we do need to have these conversations. We need to uplift the struggles that we're seeing here, and we need to make sure that we are addressing it. And to me, I feel a sense of more responsibility as an elected official, as a person that's representing 330,000 people. I see my responsibility to being able to have those conversations on the county floor and to be able to pinpoint when there are these very bad structural problems and in policy. My background is in healthcare public policy, so I understand that aspect, and we need to be sure to address it. We need to be sure that we are moving forward and really starting, yes, with if we have to do the smaller things now, but we need to think big picture. We need to do strategic planning. We need to look at a lot of this stuff. I'm very glad that the county right now has 7 new commissioners who are having these conversations, who are looking, yes, at equity and looking at this, but not just looking at, oh, what do we do now? How do we elevate equity now, but how do we do it 20, 30 years? How do we continue to invest again in communities that have been for a very long time disinvested in? So that's how I see my role, and I'm very committed to that. Thank you.
And I'll just speak on the mayor's office behalf. You mentioned that the film sort of elevated the fact that Mayor Daley was vilified. And some people might feel a way about that. I think warranted. He's in a position, or he was in a position, where there was very powerful privilege. I mean, to be sitting on the 5th floor, you have the power of making very fast and quick decisions that will impact the entire city. And that's not a privilege you should be taking lightly. And that's clearly what we saw in the film. But this did not end with Daley. As we know, this is an issue that has spanned administrations that came before him and came after him.
There was only one administration after him.
Well, there's 2.
Oh, to
Yeah.
the mail. Yes. Okay. Sorry. I was just saying
yeah.
you could just say
Yeah,
it.
sure. The Emanuel administration struggled with this, of their own doing at times, and I think our administration will do so as well. And something that shouldn't be so radical, but is happening right now is that Mayor Lightfoot, she ran on a campaign to address racial equity. Some people followed her on that. Others, were resistant to understand it. But she also won in all 50 wards, which means that there's some indicator that Chicago's ready for change, whatever that looks like. One active piece of change that she made is she hired a chief equity officer within her first week. So this is someone who has the responsibility to build a long-term strategy on not just talking about equity, not just checking box about equity, but having a strategic plan to make sure that your livelihood and your survival is not going to be based on your zip code and based on your conditions when you were born. And this chief equity officer will also lead what will be the Office of Equity and Racial Justice. And unless we call it that, that's never even going to happen, which is something that I think one woman pointed out before our panel started, that if you give people the option not to talk about it, they won't. And another question you brought up is around, as folks that work in the public sector, what do we see our roles being? I think something that I've been thinking about just in my job, but also from watching this film, is that we have to leave City Hall more often. So much of what we do, thank you. So much of what we do is making decisions for people that we don't see in City Hall. I don't see in City Hall. I did not grow up in Chicago. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I was too young to maybe know in '95 what was actually happening. So I think the shock of this movie is just really affecting me. But we don't interface with people that have real problems that we are supposedly trying to solve. And if we're decision makers, decision making is outweighing of consequences. And without the proper data that we need to make those decisions and understand what those consequences are and have a level of compassion to say that those consequences will not do for these communities, we're not going to make the right decisions.
Thanks for that. Thanks for all of the panelists on this. We're going to turn to the audience now to get some of their questions. And sorry, I was just giving you a hard time. I take every opportunity I can to take a jab at former Mayor Emanuel. We have a question in the back, gentlemen.
Thank you. Agreed to everything that you say. Anya, you were at my house several months ago, and thank you for being on the street to communicate with the people. So I think that we have to be responsible, me as a citizen, to bring other citizens together in a sense of community, and that's what we did at the 2100 block of West 18th Place. It was filthy, it was dirty, there was a lot of dog poop and just stuff on the curbs, and we got together as a group on the 2200 block, and we started sweeping the curbs every other Saturday morning at 8 o'clock, and we developed a sense of community. When there were gang signs, we wiped them out. We got a petition of about 145 names. The alderman took note when there were 145 signatures. He committed to getting lighting on the block so that there would be less drug trafficking. There was coordination with the police and the TAC teams. It's not a perfect situation or solution, but we did clean up the block. When homes were abandoned and kids would come in, we would board up the windows. When they opened the windows, we would reboard them up again. When the sidewalks were being resurfaced, some of the gangbangers would put their initials on. We would resurface the surface and wipe out the gang signs, and they would put them back on, and we would come out again, and we would resurface. So it was a little chess game going on. So this is kind of what we got to do as a community, in my estimation. We've got to get more trees and ask for more trees, and then we get more trees, and then we take care of our own properties and invest little by little, and then it gradually grows. And I'm just looking at it from a bottom-up position, and that's what we did for a number of years, and it turned around. So that's my input to it.
I mean, I'd like to comment. I'm glad that you're able to create community, but I think that's the first step. I think that looking long term, we need to look at the investments in our communities, and we need to look at why are young people getting involved with gang activity. That's the first question. We need to figure out why they haven't been given the opportunity to go to school. Why haven't they had job opportunities? Why are there boarded up houses? Where is the investment? So I'm so glad that you're able to create community, that you're able to have dialogue with your neighbors. But also we need to take a step further and then look at who is responsible for that type of activity. And I think that we need to look at that. And as elected officials, as people in the public sector, we need to dissect that and make sure that we're addressing those issues just as much or even more than that. So thank you for creating your community and having those dialogues with your neighbors.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I mean, it starts potentially with this, but I want the city to also have responsibility and be thinking about what the role of city government is in this. To give a concrete example, yesterday I was at a meeting at City Hall with folks from a lot of different departments. Opioid crisis is one of the main things that the health department is working on. You know, you look at, there's an 8.8 year black-white life expectancy gap if you look, not the neighborhoods, but just race across Chicago. And there's, you know, we're really focusing on the 5 top things that drive that inequity. The biggest one is chronic disease, but then right in there is infant mortality still, HIV still, and other infectious diseases. Opioids are in there. And so as we focus on opioids, this meeting yesterday was about how can, you know, the Department of Transportation actually, in some of these areas that are hardest hit, what can you do to make sure that the lighting is getting fixed and the curb carves are getting done, and what are you doing about boarded up houses and vacant lots, and what can you do physically in a space to make sure that that space becomes a space that is less inviting for drug activity, at the same time as you're working on making sure people have access to treatment. And, you know, meeting folks where they are. But I do think that the city has a role to play here, and there is a real commitment, you know, to South and West Side, and that is absolutely appropriate and as it should be. But there is, you know, decades worth of disinvestment that the city's going to be working against.
I would also add that there is and I know we're going to get long here, but I'd also add that you always got to look at intentionality. Things just don't happen. There's intentionality that may go back years. So when you want to know some things, sometimes you go, I don't know if it's still up there, but there's a city Department of Planning. And I did that when I was getting ready to buy a house. When I bought my house over in Dearborn, what was now Dearborn Park 2. But at that time, between Roosevelt Road, State Street, and going down to probably 14th, all the way to the Beatrice Food Building, there was nothing there. But I looked up and learned that they were going to build a whole new community there called Dearborn Park 2. And the plans for all the infrastructure was there. I'm going to say the two things. I say that for 2 reasons. Number one, sometimes things are where they are because there's a plan for it. You just don't see it yet. So you need to go look to see what those plans are. 2, a number of these communities, like the ones we saw that become disinvested, there's sometimes intentionality in that disinvestment. What do I mean? Well, when I look at, and I've lived in Chicago most all the life I've known about, except maybe the first few months, but I can see that and as we look at it as a health department, we have the data, and I'm sure Chicago has data, we can see changes in population. We know. We've got 10, 12, 20, 30-year data. And if you look at that data and begin to see what's happening, you can see, for example, the white population in Chicago is increasing in the heart of the city. The black population in Chicago, over 200,000 people have moved out. The suburban Chicago, when the city did their transformation for public housing, moved and took all those people that I'm talking about on a 33 block, almost 4 miles, a little more than 4 miles between 22nd Street and 55th Street on State Street, which were all projects. Then the ones that were on the west side and the ones, the Cabrini Green projects on the north side. Now, what's in those places and what's planned for those places there's a little market rate housing that's going to be there, but most of it will not be. And so when you see these things happen, and I'll give you one other story that reminds me of my childhood when I lived in Inglewood. The neighborhood that we call Woodlawn. Woodlawn, people think about gang violence now. It was really a lot of gang violence then. This is back in the 60s. What happened? The gang violence, for whatever reason, never got fixed. Housing values plummeted. Speculators came in, bought up all the land, and now you can't afford a place over there. So the same thing is getting ready to happen as you look at the connection of the lakefront property from Evanston all the way to Indiana. If you look at these plans, you'll see that and I'm not saying anything that somebody's doing some things necessarily intentionally, but you got to understand that the people that move this city are the people who bring the financial resources and want to make these properties more tax roll increasing kind of properties. So but that's just a fact. And now you can see what's happening all in South Shore. A lot of those same thing is happening in South Shore. So there's always something else you need to look at, and you can see it in the plans.
Now we have another question.
It doesn't look like it.
I think it just needs to be closer to your mouth.
No.
Here's a different one.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, what struck me with watching this movie is how awful being invisible can be, especially when there were all those tombs in the potter's field and nobody to go to the person's funeral. And what really struck me was after 9/11, I bought a book of the obituaries of everybody that died in 9/11 that came from the New York Times. And these were real people with real stories and real lives and not just numbers. And with the heat wave, it makes it sound like these are just numbers. You're just a number. You're not a person. And it's so important that the people have, they're real people that need someone that cares. Like if they had done like little biographies of all these people in a book, then people would have known that there's like a whole life story behind 725 people. And so it's so important that you know your neighbors. This isn't a question, it's just an observation, but that I really realized how important it was to have all those stories, all those obituaries, know that these people had lives, had impression on other people. And I think that going forward, that's something that will go a long way to preventing these kinds of anonymous deaths and just, a number in a tomb in a potter's field. So.
It was very moving when he was reading the names.
What you just mentioned is so true. I think. Yeah.
We had another question, and unless there was I'm sorry.
No, it's very moving that you say that, because something that I kept thinking about every time we say the word deaths, we're taking the humanity away from the person. So I wholeheartedly agree with you. I agree with the fact that I was 6 years old when this happened. I was not living in Chicago. And seeing this is very powerful. But again, we need to be reminded that they were people with families. And we cannot just acknowledge the death. We cannot just acknowledge a place. We need to say their names, and we definitely need to bring back that humanity, because then we become numbed. The fact that it's been 24 years and this is not talked about, and that we're not looking at the possibility of, yes, there's still 3,200 lives each year that are lost. We need to examine that, and we need to continue to have these conversations and address it, not in a reactive way, but in a proactive way, and really bring back that humanity that is so needed here in the city of Chicago.
First of all, I wanted to thank you very, very much for this film. It's often the case that I've noticed as a longtime Chicagoan that some of the best kind of observations about Chicago and even critiques are from outsiders, so-called not Chicagoans. So I deeply appreciate this movie. I am a policy expert on the unemployment crisis, and I thank you for mentioning that in the film, but I'd really like to hear from some of the panelists, because the underlying causes, especially since the Great Recession, of massive black exodus and of the hollowing out of the city, I know how the population has changed. Those people with jobs are all on the north and the northwest side, and the entire south and western parts of the city have completely depopulated and have the very highest rates of unemployment. And if people had good jobs, they might not be in these situations that we're finding out. And of course, the unemployment crisis is intensely concentrated in Black and Latino neighborhoods in Chicago as well. So I'd like to hear, what are the plans for job creation in Chicago? Thank you.
I can start there. And thank you for the question. Is everyone hearing me on this mic? Yeah. Okay. I think something, I work specifically on the sustainability team for the policy office. And so when I think of unemployment, I'm looking at how we can bring all of Chicago forward, and not just a few individuals forward, where we look to make what's called a just transition from our dirty economy to our clean economy, right? And I think a couple plans, I can speak specifically for the sustainability team and then elevate it to some things that the mayor is talking about. On the sustainability team, something that we're very aware of is the fact that Chicago is behind on transitioning to solar energy, and one thing the city can do is be a good role model. And so something that we're currently working on is taking city-owned vacant lands that has no slated development and also has a lot of environmental remediation where it will not be easy or inexpensive to build on for ground-mounted solar. So what this means is that we will have solar panels that are visible, and we'll start to encourage the idea of building more solar energy and renewable energy in the city. But it'll also mean that the city gets 40% of the electricity that's generated from those panels. The remainder, 60%, goes out to the community, and CHA residents can now be owners of renewable energy generation and get no less than 50% off their electricity bills, which is a huge, which is a great burden that's taken off of these families. And all of these sites for solar are on the far south side, and we're trying to reinvest in these vacant lands that no one can do anything on. And in part of this project, in building these solar panels and in building these systems out citywide, there is a commitment to have the job force be local hiring, and to make sure that folks from city colleges that are working on electrical engineering are getting programs that are very fit to join the rest of the city in clean energy. And so those jobs are not left behind. They're not just going to folks with fancy degrees on the north side. So that's one example of where we as a city can try to move the needle and say, this is important. If we select a developer who's doing this, they need to have very ambitious local hiring requirements that include minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses. As far as the mayor's plan, something that she ran on and will hopefully see as her administration goes on is the idea that these communities already know what's lacking. If it's between outreach and education, or if it's between access, our money needs to go into access. And so how can we get them to have access to health facilities and have access to employment, not just because we're reinvesting the communities that these folks live in, but they also have access to other parts of the city that we've been working on for decades. And so the idea of access and transit-oriented development, either through rail or through bus, means that as folks are moving around Chicago, they're seeing around them investment in their communities.
I can't speak to the city's plans, but I just wanted to emphasize your point. Unemployment is so directly connected with health issues. It's also very directly connected with crime and with violence. And while the city has increased the number of jobs that are actually in the city a fair amount over the last few years, although not as much as, say, Houston or Dallas or Washington, D.C. or other cities, that growth has disproportionately left out the south and west sides of Chicago. And so while downtown job growth has increased, downtown jobs held by African Americans has actually decreased. And it's a point that I remember writing about and kind of got brushed off by the Emanuel administration, hence my somewhat desire to take jabs at them. Sorry, I digress. One of the other points, too, in Chicago and in Illinois, when Chicago is compared with its peers, the 10 largest cities in America, Illinois as a state overall, with all 50 states, highest unemployment for African Americans. So your point is a very good point to make, and one that should be kept in the minds of the good folks who are here on the panel and their colleagues. Another question?
Just wanted to comment about the statement about unemployment, specifically on the west and the south side. My husband and I did live through the heat crisis of 1995. We had gotten married in 93, and I think that summer we were moving from an apartment into our first house. I grew up on the west side, 60644. He grew up on the south side, 60620. We moved, got married, moved into a house on the south side, 60619. I think that the issue of unemployment on the west side and south side, and it ties a lot into, we talk about the population, the black population has ended up moving outside of the city. It's not so much, I feel like, that people on the west side or the south side are unemployed, they may be underemployed, but then when you have those people who are employed, we're a solid couple in terms of two income, solid middle class. We chose to live in the city. We had every intention of staying in the city, but then it became the situation of, you know, it's hard to build community when we're all running in different directions. You know, living in Avalon Park, there was nothing there. Once we had a child and I wanted to put her in activities, we had to get in the car and either drive to Hyde Park or drive to Beverly. So even with school, you know, the schools that we chose to put her in a Catholic school, we had to pay for. Even within our community, that school wasn't up to par. So then you have this situation where, you know, I want to stay and build this community, but when there's nothing there for me, it's hard to stay. And I've always said, you know, and I'm a Chicago public school teacher, so to some extent that ties me to the city. But when I'm teaching my students, I teach primary, you know, I tell them that education is the key to give you choices. Because I would hear other people, especially, you know, non-black teachers telling the students, you know, education is going to be your way to get out. And I say education doesn't have to be your way to get out, but it gives you choices. You may choose to leave, you may choose to stay and try to make things better, but it gives you that choice. So I think that, you know, the point is sad when you want to be in a community, but you feel like there's nothing there to support you, and then you have the guilt of if you leave, because you have the economic resources to have the choice of leaving. What happens to the people that you're leaving behind? And those people are my students, and my students look just like me. So, you know, it's a lot. I think that the fact that, you know, a lot of people, I think someone made the comment of maybe 80% of Chicago don't know that this exists. That in and of itself is sad, because being a minority, we always know what the majority life is about. You know, whether we learn it in school, see it on TV, we always know. But when the shoe is on the other foot, no one knows about the minority. No one takes that effort to step out and learn. And, you know, all of this goes back. I mean, I could literally be here forever, but even with my students, the crime and all of that, I try to teach them, value yourself. Because if you value yourself, then that will stop a lot of the violence. I tell them every day, you know, I'm driving to work and somebody cuts me off. I'm upset enough to want to hurt somebody, but I care too much about me. And I have, you know, first graders who are, you know, fighting, and parents coming in fighting. And sometimes it just gets so overwhelming. Like, I'll come home and I told my husband, I was like, you know, you feel like you can't make a difference. But I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. I know definitely, you know, having the conversations, but I did just want to make the point that, you know, look at why a lot of black people who are in a position end up having to leave or choosing to leave because it's nothing there. So then that becomes a cycle. So we're taken away from the community again. So I don't know.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that it always goes hand in hand. Yes, we need to address the unemployment, and yes, we're the highest with, black males being unemployed, but even further, like, young people, 16 to 18 specifically in black communities, are the highest unemployment in the whole region, if not country. So we need to, yes, address that portion, but again, I go back to the investment in communities. We can't have people that are have the job opportunities but do not have the other resources, particularly like a grocery store, a school, community center, etc. At the county level, that's something that we're looking at. I'm the chair of the Economic Development Committee and also the chair of the Cook County Social Innovation. So we're looking at how do we invest in not only like specific areas, but how do we invest in people? How do we invest and potentially like co-ops? How do we have people that are already in their community and want to stay in their community, that want to start a business? How are we doing our part to help in those endeavors and continue to help in the development of like community block grants, etc. So it does go hand in hand. We hope that we're addressing the unemployment rate, but we need to, it takes much, much more than just addressing that. It's going to take real investment in our communities, in our streets, in our housing, etc.
Commissioner, I just hope that as we do that in a way that doesn't sort of deflate the drive for people to be more engaged. Someone talked about the West Side. And well, the West Side was a thriving community. It was a big Jewish community. And they had a lot of Jewish businesses there. They were the big candy company, I forget the name of it, Brock's was there. There were a number of things. And when in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when the Great Migration took place, and blacks started moving up into the west side of Chicago, Jewish people started moving out. And I think that we also have to be very critical in our analysis of how people move forward and how, I grew up in the south side of the city where we had 23 black automobile dealerships, 6 banks, all kinds of things that are all but gone now. And a lot of our businesses are all gone. So there is an opportunity for us to look introspectively in terms of how we do this in a way that empowers people to see that they have an integral stake in it, not just a handout, but as somebody said, a hand up, so that people can do this with some feeling of dignity and self-worth and that ownership that this is you look at the gas stations in the black community, none of them are owned by blacks at all anymore. They used to all be, I mean, many of them. So there's been this shift that we've got to look at and think about. To your students, how do we encourage them to think about not having a job or looking for a job, but making a job?
We had the great privilege in the years of making this movie. You make a movie, you shoot a lot of material, you meet extraordinary people. Not everybody ends up there. But along the way, we got to meet the people who created and run, and now the next person who runs, Growing Home, and Rage, and Iman. Extraordinary organizations who are trying to really use a whole systems approach to address all of these issues, and revitalize and rethink how to rebuild the community and reinvest in the community. So, when you ask me, like, what do we hope to happen? What we hope to happen is that the people who are really doing incredibly revolutionary work on taking back the land, literally, taking back those boarded up buildings, taking back the bodegas, taking back healthcare, and reimagining how to do that block by block. Because as they say in the disaster world, in the first 72 hours, no one is coming for you. You're as safe as your block is organized. So, block parties are radical things. Block organizations are that social cohesion is what saves lives in an emergency. Cooling centers are cool, but they're important during a heat wave. But which buildings should be the cooling centers? If we invest and make sure that those cooling centers are also the community centers that serve a community every single day and are building economy and building, social equity and all of that, that's the right cooling center, because you're investing in that that's the right cooling center because it's a community center, or it's an organization that is working with kids and youth and empowerment, or they're rehabbing, buildings and creating a whole new local economy. So that's what I really hope is there's so much amazing innovation that's taking place in the very neighborhoods that have been decimated, and they can lead a lot of what you're talking about. And that $20 million for disaster preparedness, can you go to bat and try to figure out how to use some of that money to address what everyone's talking about? I don't think that's radical. I mean, I think that would make so much sense, don't you?
Yes, I do, and I think that if we had to do it again, if we looked as though we're going to have another heat wave, $20 million would go a long way to buy air conditioners for everybody, and defer the price of the additional electricity that they would need to run it and to install it and to do those sorts.
To the mayors, someone should, do you know, like the mayor, something happened just in the last week, right? There was a lawsuit against a landlord, and within 24 hours, because they knew the heat was coming, they forced the landlord to put air conditioners in senior housing, which was a big deal. That was just, right? Did you guys do that?
3 weeks ago. Yeah.
3 weeks ago.
Not me personally, but yeah, I heard about it.
I'm sorry, we're getting the high sign that we need to wrap up.
Yes.
So
Unless there's one more pressing question in the audience, yeah?
It's not pressing, but
Well,
how much of the media? All right, sorry. I heard about this from Channel 11, and I know BEZ has talked about this a little bit. Any other news or media organizations that have put you guys or made the public aware that this is out right now?
We got great. We've gotten amazing press, really amazing press. The most important thing when you get press is to try and utilize that moment to say the right thing, right? I mean, obviously, hey, join us at the theater, but Fennell and I we've had the opportunity to be on TV and on the radio, and we're like, okay, what's going to be that soundbite so that we could actually speak to the underlying disaster and get everybody to sort of see, that the 2,300 people who die every single year are real people with real families who should not be dying, and that's the emergency, and how are we going to address that? So we've been getting extraordinary press, but it's only to leverage this kind of conversation and then to make sure that this kind of conversation gets extended and is utilized, and that, you know, that if we can like challenge everybody to reframe disaster, reframe preparedness, reframe resilience, so that we could actually address the underlying disaster in a real live way, then that press is good. That's what we've been trying to work for.
All right, if there are no more pressing questions, Judith, I don't know if you wanted to close us out or.
Could you close us out?
With prayer.
However you want to. However way you
You know,
want to.
I grew up in it. You know, you say close us out. I'm thinking, okay, Heavenly Father, you know.
Whatever you want to do, Dr. Mason.
No.
Floor is yours.
First of all, let me say I think this was an incredible film. You are to be congratulated for taking this on.
Now, Partemquin Films.
And
there were a lot of Chicagoans who made this movie, not just this outsider Jewish.
no, but I think it opened up an opportunity for great dialogue, and I hope that we have more of it. Will it be available for wider distribution? Will it be at theaters? Will you go? How will you?
Well,
how would everybody see it?
This was our first, theatrical run, and despite us having been to many other cities for film festivals and stuff, we both feel like this was the world premiere, right? Mm-hmm. This was absolutely the world premiere. It's been extraordinary. We will continue to play, and we'll be here through Thursday. It will be on public television in 2020 on a series called Independent Lens. It will be shorter. It will be 53 minutes. It'll be okay. We actually made a really tight 53-minute version that we're really very proud of. But we aim to bring this throughout the city in very important ways. We want to do engagement with this movie, and we want to figure out the best ways to do it. We want to make sure the mayor sees it. We want to bring it to colleges and universities and high schools and churches and synagogues. And we want to figure out the right configuration of people. But most of all, for me, I want to make sure that the new brand of first responders, some of whom are in there and lots whom are doing extraordinary work that I mentioned, get to meet with the world of disaster preparedness and the mayor and the county, and that they all can like really figure out what do we mean by disaster and how do we use disaster dollars in a new and radical way. That's my biggest hope.
And maybe you could add to that list some sort of memorial to these people who died.
Actually, there is one.
Some wall or something where every single name.
There is one there there is a memorial there.
But you're talking about something for the 739 people,
Exactly.
not just the
Their
people
names,
who died. Yeah.
Something like they have the memorial wall for fallen policemen.
But it's at Homewood, which is far away. Maybe it needs to be in the city.
Yeah,
right?
It should be in the city.
Right here.
Should be in the city, and maybe that's an ask that we could put out to get people. It would get people involved again. So that's something I just thought about.
25th year is coming.
Yeah,
I mean,
25th,
to be explicit about it.
And I think if you just
I know it's going to be a conversation, at the health department in terms of what's happening, in terms, bringing this out, making this be a thing.
But I think that in honor of those 739 people, it has to be not just naming them, but it has to be in the name of health and justice for people right now, for the people who are alive, who are still alive, where they might not get to live as long as people in Streetersville. But I'm just saying, like, in order, I think that we have to.
You'll come up with something very ingenious. I can see that right now.
Well, I think it's interesting that it's going to be in the year 2020 will be the 25th anniversary. Mm-hmm. So 2020 is all about vision going forward. Mm-hmm. So in their name and in their honor, what's the vision going forward to address the inequity that killed them? Right. That's the question. Not if we just remember their names, it's absolutely not enough.
But I think you do it in a ceremonial way. Mm-hmm. That there's a story. There's just a bunch of etched names, but there's a story that who these people represent, and they were killed.
Yeah, it's killed. It's killed, and it's violent, and it was violent. It was not nonviolent.
All right, so thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank everybody for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
And stay tuned, and let's make it all happen.
Let's make it all happen.
And please drop your postcards off as you leave the theater.